You're watching Behind the Headlines. I'm Pacchia. We're talking today to Case Western Reserve Law School Dean Lawrence Mitchell. Dean Mitchell, of course, made waves in late November with a controversial op-ed in the New York Times defending law schools from their many critics. We're pleased to say he's joining us for his first on-camera interview since the article appeared. Dean, welcome. Thanks for coming in and seeing us today.
Thank you, Lee. It's a pleasure to be here.
So your article was met with some blistering criticism on the blogosphere. You were accused of being irresponsible, employing sloppy reasoning, and to some almost sounding like a used car salesman. Were you surprised at all by the criticism?
I think, Lee, I was accused of kidnapping the Lindbergh baby.
It was rough.
It was rough going. I wasn't surprised that there was criticism at all. Obviously, this is an issue that's been discussed for a couple of years. The blogs have made no bones about their opinions on law schools and how we're serving or misserving our students. So, of course, I expected disagreement. In fact, I wouldn't have written the piece had I not, the whole purpose of the piece being to start a two-sided dialogue about what till now has really been a one-sided discussion.
After your op-ed appeared, an online commenter identifying himself as a 3L at your school said, quote, "I am not asking for a dream job. I am asking for a job to pay the bills. However, at this junction, it is highly likely that I will be unemployed at this time next year," end quote. What's your response to that student and the thousands nationwide that will inevitably be finding themselves in that situation when it comes time to graduate?
Lee, I'll tell you what my response is to all of my students. In the first 14 months of my deanship, I traveled around the country meeting with the hiring partners of at least 50 law firms to talk to them about hiring my students. I then came back, I interviewed every single student who was interested personally, and personally wrote recommendations to the hiring partners for those students. I don't consider it our responsibility to get students jobs. I do consider it our responsibility to make as many opportunities available to them as they can. So the response is a response really on the ground with my feet, putting my money where my mouth is. And I believe that throughout the country, career professionals as well as deans are doing their best to try to find the opportunities for students.
That said, the economics in this situation are troubling. Case Western, like many schools, charges over $40,000 a year in tuition. I think it's 42. Yet 6 months after graduation, your institution had 38% of the class of 2011 that were either unemployed, underemployed, that is in short-term jobs or part-time jobs, or going on to get another degree. Aren't too many of your graduates finding themselves in a position where they're leaving school with enormous debts, yet no real means to pay them off?
This is certainly debt is a problem, high tuition is a problem. I should point out that 90% of my class receives financial aid at a mean financial aid offer of $25,000 a year. So people talk about the sticker prices of law schools, but we discount fairly heavily. Now, that's not to say there aren't students paying full freight or there's students paying most of the way, and it is very, very expensive. And of course, it's important that they get jobs, that they can ultimately pay that debt back with the proceeds from, the income from. At the same time, when you look at that 38%, you're looking at a 9-month picture out. Now, first place, the ABA has been refining reporting statistics along with NALP. We have from the very first tried our very best to be as transparent as we can. And if you look at some of the situations of those students, many of them are in, you say, underemployed. They're in volunteer positions. They're in positions where they receive small stipends. A school like ours, about 65% of our students leave the state of Ohio and go to major cities where, because they're not in law school there, it takes them more time to find jobs. I haven't myself taken a snapshot a year out, but I've talked to my admissions staff about this a lot, and I suspect if you looked a year out, things would change dramatically. I'm really confident if you looked a year and a half out, they would.
When we talk to people about these issues, we keep going back to the fact that tuition growth has outstripped job growth or wage growth over the past almost 2 decades at a torrid pace. Why does the cost of law school tuition keep going up?
That's a question that any responsible law school administrator thinks about all the time. First, I'll point out that at my school, 20% of my revenue comes from our endowment. So, and believe me, when I've spent my budget, there's nothing left. So it's not even that our students are paying the full amount of their education. In fact, every student is subsidized to the tune of at least 20% simply from the income on endowment. Where does the high price come from? Well, you know, I was thinking about the 85 to 2011 increase. It's often cited as being the number to look at. And medical school at 63%, for example. In 1985, medical school cost 4 times what law school cost. Also in 1985, or within a couple of years thereafter, you had a tremendous growth in starting salaries of law firms on Wall Street. Now, almost anybody who teaches law could or did have one of those law jobs. I pay my faculty probably median about what the starting salary on Wall Street is. You've got to pay talented people to be professors. So that's certainly one reason for the increase. Additionally, we pay the bills like everybody else. We've got to pay for heating, we've got to pay for lighting. As we develop program, for example, clinics and experiential education have exploded. That's a very expensive form of education. You have a highly paid teacher, or relatively highly paid teacher, teaching very small numbers of students. So when people talk about law schools as traditional cash cows, they're imagining a time when you teach 150 kids in a class, you have a relatively small faculty doing it, you were able to charge whatever the market bore, of course, but you turn a big chunk of it over to the university. I don't turn a big chunk to the university, and I'm not teaching 150 kids in each class. So as the demands for higher quality education have increased, and as we've responded to that with smaller class sizes, with more skills programs, with more other kinds of experiential endeavors, with more externships, we increase the costs.
Yeah, it sounds like as you're running through the revenue issues and the expenditures that your institution faces, it almost sounds like you're running a business at the end of the day, or facing challenges that are similar to someone running a business.
Well, of course we're running a business at the end of the day, Lee. The fact that the object of the business is very special, that is education, makes it no less a business than a news business, which is very special, or a hospital corporation. Right? So even though we're not for profit, we certainly don't generate anything resembling profit. And even though we do have this rather special purpose for what we do, it's still a business. And in fact, it's using business sense in managing law schools that's going to help us get some of these problems under control.
But it needs to be run as a business, but it also has to operate in a financial or an economic ecosystem that is dependent on other things. You're creating law graduates that go into the broader economy and go on to careers in legal services. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics projects that there will be 74,000 new lawyer jobs created this decade, yet American law schools are going to graduate something like 400,000 new lawyers during that same 10-year period. There's an oversupply problem here. What's the solution to the lawyer oversupply problem?
It's not clear to me there's an oversupply problem at all.
Really?
First,
I mean, that's a 4-to-1 ratio.
If we look, when we talk about where legal services or oversupply, we have to talk about where and how legal services are delivered, okay? So according to the Legal Services Corporation, only 20% of the needs of low-income people for legal services are being met. Right there, there's a very substantial need for lawyers. If law students contemplated going to smaller cities or going into different kinds of law paths other than the big law model that we've always held out, and we have done that, that's our fault. Almost all of us were raised and educated in a big law environment. Somehow it's in the water. But finding different paths for people who truly want to be lawyers opens up all sorts of possibilities, certainly including serving the underserved. Additionally...
But you can't do that if you're taking out 6 figures of debt.
You know, you can and you can't. We're unfortunately somehow in higher education, and I admit that it's quite expensive, we've gotten into a situation where we measure the worth of higher education by the dollar return on the investment. So it's like, we're talking about equity securities. If you're not getting a return that's substantially in excess of what you've invested, it's a bad investment. But it's not a passive investment we're talking about, like equity securities. It's an active investment. It's an investment in a career. It's an investment in a life. It's an investment in, hopefully, a fulfilling, challenging job. I have had jobs, where it was hard to get out of bed in the morning and I didn't like going to work. My own personal solution was to take a 2/3 pay cut and go into teaching, where I didn't mind going to work any day. I was happy every day of my career. So I don't want to be flip about it, but there are lots of things beyond simple gross return or net return on your tuition by which a career in the law should be measured. In addition, there are a couple of other ways in which that figure seems to me to be at least questionable. Lawyers do lots of other things. One of the bandied about statistics, and it comes from the National Association of Law Placements, is that 50% of law graduates currently go into law firms. At the very, very height of the market, only 60% of law graduates went to law firms. Traditionally, lawyers have done lots of other things. There are, for example, fulfilling careers in government. Government needs lawyers, state government, federal government, local government. Yes, those jobs pay less. They also have other compensating factors. There are security factors, there are pension factors and benefits factors, and there's a simple pleasure of doing something you think is meaningful. They also go do lots of other things. I mean, every law school can cite one or two of its graduates who have achieved something outside the norm. I, in my first months as dean, looked at our alumni body. We've got dozens. I spent 1 week where I went from the chairman of Warner Brothers to the chair of the FDIC to the chair of Wasserstein to the global head of Lazard Frères to the global head of Ernst & Young to the president of Eastman Kodak. I'm right now doing some work with the ambassador for protocol at the White House, who's my alum. I mean, this just touches the surface of what lawyers can do. Finally, I'd point out that we're dealing, as I mentioned in the op-ed, with a 40 to 50-year career. And I'll tell you a story. When I graduated from Columbia Law School in 1981, admittedly a very different time, almost all of my classmates went to work for big firms in New York. A few maybe went to LA or Washington or Chicago, but it was all big law firms. 10 years later, when they published the reunion book, almost nobody was at law firms. People were doing all sorts of fascinating things.
That said, law grads are finding themselves in a rather tough spot these days. When you take a step back and look at what's happening in legal education and law in general, what grade would you give yourself and other deans around the country in addressing those needs in a timely manner? I mean, do you and your fellow deans take any responsibility for the troubles that they are finding themselves in?
Of course we do. You're talking, one of the things that the attack on law schools, if I may call it that, disregards or doesn't assume is that we're working hard in good faith. You're talking about people, all of whom have significant opportunity costs, that have gone into this business for the sake of trying to do something good. I mean, my own purpose in becoming a dean, I had a wonderful career. I didn't have to become a dean. I resisted becoming a dean. I ultimately decided to become a dean because I thought I'd had a great career. I'd like to be able to give back and create opportunities for other people that had been created for me. And I think that's how all of us feel. So we're working really hard, most of us, to deal with a situation that's developed over time, that in this bad economy, and it may be transitional, it may not. We don't know what happens when the economy improves, but in this bad economy, we're trying to do the best we can for our students. Which is why, as I mentioned at the outset, I schlep all over the country for 2 months every summer, like Willie Loman, talking to hiring partners of law firms, trying to get my kids jobs.
Dean Mitchell, thank you for coming and talking with us today.
Lee, thanks. It was a pleasure.
If you'd like to learn more about the cases and issues we just discussed, be sure to go check out our offerings on BloombergLaw.com and also on the Bloomberg Terminal. You can see more of our videos on YouTube, and you can follow our updates on Twitter. I'm Lee Pacchia. Thanks for watching.